Welcome back. We have Shelby Volo joining us today from Abbott Wealth Financial. It's great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, great topic today. If you are considering moving in with somebody, you're not married, you need to sort of understand what the rules and regulations are around that. People think they know, but there are some devils in the details, I guess the best way to say it. So joint tenancy versus tenants in common is our topic today, Shelby.
Yes, and they sound similar, but they're not. So we have our second slide actually coming up here, which explains the difference between the two. So joint tenancy means it invokes the right of survivorship on the death of one owner, and the ownership of an asset passes in equal shares to the surviving owner. So the best way to say that in plain English is the last man standing gets the asset.
Okay.
Right? So that whole share goes over to that survivor. And that, in almost all cases, is with a spouse, right?
Okay.
Tax-free rollover. Tenants in common means the deceased owner's share of the asset becomes part of their estate. So however they want that asset distributed in their will is how it's going to happen.
Okay.
So when you have a property like a cabin or something, if you have tenants in common, then there's two owners, then the owner that dies, their whole portion of that cabin is going to go through their will, right?
Yes.
So then you're not really sure who you're going to own that asset with anymore.
Yes, that's right.
Which is really important.
Sure.
And then our next slide here. So this is kind of where we talk about the really important stuff. So cons of joint ownership.
Okay.
So number one's immediate tax consequences. So if you're going to be sharing, let's say like a second property with a lot of, we see kids being added on as a joint owner.
Yeah.
So if that happens, it's immediate tax issue because it's disposition of property for income tax purposes, and then it triggers any unrealized gains. So if we think about older generations, they bought cabins for $25,000 back then, right?
Yes.
And now their cabins are worth like upwards of $300,000 depending on where they're situated.
Sure.
So then that's a really big gain, right? So that's important. And then exposure to creditors and marital breakdown. So if you own something with your kid and they got married and then divorced and they were joint owner on your asset, their spouse can come after your cabin, right?
Wow.
So that's important. And then the other thing is let's say you had a 21-year-old kid that was on joint ownership.
Yes.
They got maybe they were drinking under the influence, cause an accident, and we're going to get sued for it.
Wow.
Then they can actually, if they were joint ownership on your property, then your property's up for grabs too. Loss of control. So obviously on a bank account, if you had a joint owner, they could actually, if they had sole ownership of the bank account, they could just drain your bank account if they wanted to, right? I mean, I think if you put your kids on there, most kids aren't going to do that to you, but that's something you have to think about as well.
Sure.
And the other thing is with mostly joint property, if you do have a will and you have more than one child, it's kind of important to maybe rethink the joint ownership with one kid.
Okay.
Because it doesn't form part of your will anymore or your estate. So if that child decides maybe they get in a dispute with their other sibling and they don't want to, you know, distribute the cabin, for example, fairly, then they don't have to because it doesn't form part of that estate anymore.
Right.
So if you have one kid, it's a totally different story. When it's two, you should probably give it a lot of thought and definitely talk to a lawyer about that. And then our next slide here. So the pros, obviously, there has to be some pros if you're going to add a joint owner on there. So you avoid some probate fees on passing. You avoid the Wills Variation Act. And you avoid costs and delays associating with obtaining probate. Sure. Because when things go through your estate, you know, then there's probate, and especially if there's multiple people associated with the will, then it takes even longer. Right. So that's a really important one. And our next slide here. So this is a really good story from the Globe and Mail. Yes. So we have Miss Blake. She owned a cabin with rights of survivorship with her son. So kind of exactly like what we're talking about. ACB, so adjusted cost base, $25,000. That means that's what she paid for it. Fair market value, $650,000. Great investment. So we know we're going to have a huge gain, right? So, and the only other asset she has is a $600,000 investment portfolio with an adjusted cost base of $400,000. Okay. So what does that mean when Mrs. Blake passes away? Well, she has a $69,615 tax bill on the cottage alone because she's deemed to have sold her portion of it, right? Wow. And then that flows over. And then $46,410 of tax would be deemed against the investment portfolio. So we know right there we have two pretty big tax bills that we're going to have to cover.
That's huge.
It is huge. So that's kind of why estate planning is so important, and doing it early, because a lot of the times you can avoid those tax bills, not avoid them, but you could put insurance in place to make sure they're covered.
Yes.
And then you're also making sure that there's going to be an equal estate distribution, which is why we're going to go to the next slide.
Okay.
So her estate didn't own the cottage because it was in joint ownership with rights of survivorship.
Okay.
So it doesn't form part of the estate at all, kind of like what we already talked about. So who's going to cover that estate bill? Well, the only asset in the estate is actually that investment portfolio. So the daughter only receives $483,975. Mrs. Blake actually intended for her to get $600,000 to make things equal with her son.
Yes.
So this was not her intentions, and this is one really good example of not doing proper estate planning.
Yes.
So had the cottage passed to a spouse, just to be clear, it would have just rolled over tax-free, and we wouldn't have seen that tax bill.
Right.
Just like to make that clear, just the tax is when it's a non-related party.
Okay.
Or not non-related, but not your spouse.
Yes.
Yes. And then their next slide here, still going on about this story. So what are our solutions? Well, number one, had it not been joint ownership, then the cottage would have actually formed part of the estate, and then that would have had to help pay that tax bill, whether you had to sell the cottage off or not. It would have resulted in more probate fees. The children would have been treated fairly, and the son could have actually used his portion of the inheritance to purchase the cottage from the estate, which at the end of the day would be a lot more fair to the two children. And then the second option is she could have bought life insurance to equalize the estate, like I mentioned, or to cover off the tax bill that she could have kind of predetermined what it was when doing proper planning. Or so the insurance policy could have been around $150,000, and it would have saved a lot of headache and hassle at the end of the day. So I thought this was a really good story to bring up, because it makes it a little bit more clear and a lot easier English to understand, because some of these, you know, it just kind of flies right over your head with all the different language.
So even though you have the best of intentions, you think that you're doing the right thing, it's better to go in and talk to somebody and make sure that you actually are not going to get dinged, like your death doesn't cause all these headaches.
Absolutely. And it is really important that you not only see a lawyer, which obviously is extremely important, but you should see your financial planner as well, because the two of them could actually work really well as a team and come up with the best solution for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was some hefty tax bills that they were staring down.
They're pretty big. Yeah.
All right, Shelby, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Very welcome. If you have any questions for Abbott Wealth, information is on the screen. Their phone number, 372-3736. We are back after a quick break. Stay with us.